Congressman Smith, great to speak with you. My name is Blair Daly. I grew up in Bellevue. I live in Redmond now. And about 5 years ago, I started Washington Initiative for Boys and Men. And there's basically two main activities that WIBM is up to. One is what I think of as advocacy journalism, where I'm writing articles and making videos that highlight a wide range of what I think of as boys and men's issues that have some kind of local angle, so some connection to Washington State. The second main activity that WIBM is up to is grassroots political organizing and coordinating, building a network, a coalition of people that kind of share this interest to say that we want everyone to thrive, and that includes boys and men. And so actually some advocacy focused on our male population is appropriate, is needed. And on that political side, it includes reaching out to state legislators, getting meetings with as many as we can to put boys and men's issues on their radars, including asking for their support for the legislation that's been around in Olympia for 4 years now, coming up on 5 years, where if that bill passed, it would create a state level commission on boys and men. And then I also monitor all the bills that are filed through this kind of lens of being like a citizen advocate or a grassroots lobbyist for the male population. That's how I think of it. Boys, male youth, and men from all backgrounds and all ages within Washington State. So when I talk about boys and men's issues, some of the ones that we're most interested in would be things like educational achievement, building of skills toward good job opportunities. It's physical and mental health, looking at things like rates of suicide, the growing lifespan gender gap that we're seeing, issues like homelessness, deaths from drug abuse and alcohol, incarceration, and issues of fatherhood, where wanting as many kids as possible to benefit from involved dads in their lives. So I wanted to start by asking you what issues you're seeing out there related to boys and men's well-being, and then what changes, what improvements you'd like to see.
Yeah, and I think you listed them quite well. And there's been a whole bunch of different studies about this. It's not really, I think, debatable now that boys and men are facing significant challenges in our society, and you outlined them. Suicide, drug abuse, despair, if you will, lack of a sense of purpose, the educational gap that is growing. So I think we have to recognize that. Now, the more complicated part of the question is why and what should we do about it? But I think as a starting point, doing things like what you're doing is acknowledge the problem. Don't pretend that it's not there, and then start the conversation about how to deal with it and have an open and honest conversation about what some of those challenges are and how our society has shifted and changed in the last 20 years or so that could have exacerbated that problem. So I think the commission would be a great idea. Obviously, there's all kinds of political things that you get into on this issue. And I think the problem is what our society and culture is wrestling with. And I'm about to do something that is of highly questionable intelligence here. But I've got to sort of walk through the history without having a specific, answer to where it goes. But look, our society, beyond any shadow of a doubt, was racist and sexist for a very, very long period of time. I always tell this story. So I was adopted. My biological mother was in the Foreign Service. She was a code clerk for the State Department. I was born in 1965. I spent like 10 days in literally a home for unwed mothers in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. before I was, given up for adoption. But part of the problem was at the time, the State Department would not employ a married woman. And the thinking was if you were married, you were a woman, you had a man who could take care of you. So you didn't need a job, A. B, you were taking a job from a man who had a family to take care of. And this was a widespread opinion. So I think a lot of people don't have a full appreciation for just how sexist our society was. And certainly you had the notion that as a woman, you had to stay in a marriage no matter how bad it was because you owed it. This is the J.D. Vance way of looking at the world. And there were all of these issues. So society, quite rightly, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s said, this is unfair. What's happening with women. There's a child support issue that I worked on when I was in the state legislature, because historically in the 70s and 80s, if divorce happened, typically the man was the primary breadwinner. and the woman would get custody. So the money left and the children stayed, and you had a lot of children. So we got very aggressive about child support. And all of that was fine, but it also really pushed a narrative in broader society that men were a problem to be solved. Okay, that and if you shouldn't spend any time thinking about them because it's a male-dominated society, they've got everything taken care of, don't need to think about them at all. And I think that pushed it to some extremes that left us thinking that there's a balance here. Okay, substituting one bias for a different bias is not a positive. And I think we saw that in some of the laws that were passed and some of the ways society looked at things. And this made it much more difficult on men and young boys as well, who were trying to learn from male role models, trying to learn what their society, what is their role in society? How does society think about them? And I'm sure you've heard this. Someone wrote a column a while ago about how, if you're a woman in the woods, you'd rather come across a bear than a man. And I raise that issue as, if that's the way we as a society look at men collectively, not in an individual situation, then that tends to have a very negative psychological effect. And then to your other point, okay, men dominate everything. They don't need their own groups. They don't need their own societies. They used to have all these clubs that excluded women, and they did it for this, and that's where the power was, and it was okay, but every other segment of our society is permitted to gather amongst their similar kind, except for men. Okay. Or if they do, it is looked down upon as if those men trying to find camaraderie with each other are exactly the same as those men back in the 1950s who thought women shouldn't work and it's okay to beat your wife. They're not the same. Okay. They have a reason to want to try to come together that is not necessarily, well, sorry, is not going to be nefarious. And so that just sort of led to a psychological impact on men and boys that said, if you're a man or a boy, the first thing you have to realize when you look into the mirror is you're a bad, awful, terrible person, and you better fix that. And that has a powerful psychological effect on how you view yourself. And I've gone on for a while here, but final point on this is, and that is one of the keys to mental health. I went through a thing, as I mentioned, I was adopted. I had some problems with my adopted family as I was growing up. I had a lifetime of anxiety that got clinical and really problematic. So I had to do 3.5 years worth of psychotherapy and learned a lot of different things. But one of them is the key, the cornerstone of mental health. I mean, you've got behavioral health, you've got, cognitive behavioral therapy, you've got trauma and all that. But the cornerstone of anyone's mental health is self-worth. If you don't have a sense of your own self-worth, and that can be damaged by things that happen in society, that the phrase, not to sound too new agey here, but to believe that you are worthy of love. Okay, if you don't believe that, then it's going to screw up everything else you're doing. And if we're raising young men and boys to believe that they are bad in a variety of different ways, then you're undercutting their self-worth and undercutting their ability to be productive members of our society. That actually came out okay. I wasn't sure where I was going with that, but that's sort of my summary of where we're at. Now, and again, I don't presume to know what the problem is. I certainly don't want to go back to the days that, again, J.D. Vance is talking about where, women had to stay home. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about figuring out what's going on with boys and men so that they can have a sense of self-worth and be more positive contributors to the society around them.
You have a son and a daughter,
Yes.
and the need to rise together seems pretty apparent to me. Richard Reeves of the American Institute for Boys and Men talks about that. I'll also mention the nonpartisan or bipartisan nature of the advocacy that WIBM is up to. And I think that's partly reflected in the fact that when it comes to the co-sponsors of the legislation at the state level for a commission on boys and men, it's very bipartisan. And so I mentioned we're 4 years into this effort, but as of 2025, the bill between the Senate bill and the House bill had 24 sponsors, which was one out of every 6 members of the legislature was signed on formally in support of the bill. And that was 14 Democrats and 10 Republicans. So it's almost even bipartisan support.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way of looking at it. I mean, there's a political implication of this for me as a Democrat, whereas I think my party is doing great damage to itself in the way we're alienating the male portion of our population. But that's a separate political thing. I think the problem for society writ large, you have described quite well, and I think there should be a bipartisan, nonpartisan approach to how do we deal with it.
Great. Okay. I understand you are a member of the Congressional Men's Health Caucus. And I read in a recent Movember report that they said it's been a couple of decades, which I didn't realize it's been that long, but that there's been federal legislation to create a Office of Men's Health in the Department of Health and Human Services, known as the Men's Health Awareness and Improvement Act. And I wonder if you can give any insight into progress with that.
Yeah. Well, the fact that it's been around for 2 decades and we haven't done it yet, so to give us a little bit insight, the fact that we're not quite there, I think we need to overcome some of those things I talked about earlier. But I think that's another aspect of it is we've done a lot in the last couple of decades saying, okay, what are the specific needs of women? And I think that is absolutely appropriate. Women's health is unique and in many cases was not paid attention to. And the reason was historical biases. Men tended to dominate the healthcare profession and all of that, didn't have that understanding. But I also think we're not paying attention to the specifics of men's health. And part of it is, culturally, men are not supposed to think about those sorts of things. And I think there are specific challenges and problems that men have. And I think in the same way, that it's very important to have specific understandings of the challenges in women's health. I think you would need the same for men as well. I would hope we would be able to accomplish that sometime soon.
Yeah, one example related to that I'll share is actually going back to 2006 in the state legislature, which was after your time, but closer to when you were in the state legislature. Um, the legislature passed a bill creating a health disparities council. And I looked into the history of that, and what I found is that there was one legislator who advocated for the inclusion of men's health issues. Um, and ultimately, he failed. And so, what the Washington State Health Disparities Council is concerned with are health disparities affecting people of color and women. And so, we've
Yeah.
left out boys and men. And that exists until today, where technically under statute, that's the case. And so the legislators were bringing back a bill to make some changes to our Health Disparities Council, including renaming it Health Council on Justice and Equity and some other changes. And one of those changes included adding a seat on the Health Disparities Council for different existing commissions, like the Women's Commission, LGBTQ Commission, different race and ethnicity-based commissions. So I partnered with quite a few organizations that joined me, including the King County Medical Society, labor unions. We all signed in as other on the bill, asking for an inclusion of an advocate for men and boys' health if we're going to go to this direction of having, people assigned to advocate for different population groups on our Health Disparities Council, recognizing that the statute still doesn't even say that men's health disparities shall be of concern to the Health Disparities Council. So they didn't end up bringing that bill for a floor vote. But we didn't succeed in our request to amend the bill to add that. But meanwhile, going into the 2026 session, it looks like a progressive female Democrat, by the way, is going to carry the mantle forward on this and prime sponsor her own bill. And so it does show a lot of progress. Washington State is, I think, a special place in many ways. And one of those ways can be that we're going to set history. We're going to make some history as being the first state with such a commission on boys and men.
Yeah, no, I think that would be great. And we want to strive to make this bipartisan and to recognize that the fights that other, communities are going through, whether it's, women, LGBTQ, Black people, Hispanic people, Native Americans, those fights are incredibly important. And certainly the history of discrimination, racism, bigotry, misogyny that we've had in this country should inform that, but it shouldn't be a reason to sort of turn that around and ignore men. I think we can do both. And I'm glad you're making progress on that and having that conversation.
Thank you. And of course, there's so much overlap between those efforts and what we're doing here because half of all those Native Americans and Black Washingtonians and Hispanic Washingtonians are boys and men.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
No, I think that's something we're discovering. And, I know again, not to get into the politics of it, But that's something I think that was quite shocking to a lot of my Democratic friends, that the Democratic Party began to lose ground with Black Americans, with Hispanic Americans, with Asian, with all these different groups that we presumed would be more sympathetic to us. And I think part of the reason is because the men in those populations really did feel like they were being ignored. And and put down in many instances. So we need to broaden that coalition to include, men and their concerns.
I can share the good news that I believe it was just last week that the second legislative district Democrats here in Washington passed a resolution supporting the legislation for a commission on boys and men. So they were
That's
the
good.
first Democratic LD to do so. And then just a couple nights ago, the 48th district, Bellevue, Kirkland, Redmond, they also passed a resolution of support. So it's happening.
Well, that's what makes your work so important. To really just go out there and meet with people and educate them on what you're working on in a positive, non-confrontational way. Because so much of the time, the issues that we're talking about here become very partisan and very confrontational. And that may serve the interests of a given candidate in a given race. It does not serve the interests of our society trying to solve problems and improving the quality of life for our community. So I think your work is really important in taking that approach.
Thank you. And by the way, I often invite others to partner with me as co-presenters when I get these speaking opportunities, others who are seen to represent other population groups.
Yeah.
And I find that to be effective. Richard Reeves with the American Institute for Boys and Men, he talks about the importance of more men in our K to 12 classrooms, in education, in the teaching workforce. And one of the things he mentions is that men are more likely on average than women if they're serving as a teacher in a school to also coach sports. And the importance to boys of having mentors through sports and through coaching, he emphasizes that, and I believe strongly in that. I played a lot of team sports and probably had a lot of like my social development occur among my team, and then also uh, being taught like good lessons and
Yeah.
accountability and to be, to be strong and strive for excellence from my coaches. So I wondered if you'd comment on that as someone who's coached a little bit yourself.
Sure. No, I think sports are incredibly important. I sort of have 3 points on this. One, I think you're right. I played sports growing up, baseball and soccer mostly, and made some great friends. And also, there's so many important lessons in that. And also, men's approach is a little bit different. We are more aggressive, more interested in competition, not all the time. But in general, I just had this story in Hawaii on vacation once when my son and daughter, I don't know, they must have been like 6 and 9, and they were playing in the pool, and my wife and I were watching them, and there were these three boys who were there too. And these three boys are grabbing each other and dunking each other and doing this whole, just the whole thing. And my daughter and son are just sort of swimming in the pool. My son's watching this. And eventually at one point he goes over and dunks his sister, just like, and she gets up like, what the hell? What are you doing, Jack? So there are differences there that we need to respect in young people and develop. So the other thing I'll say, and I think this is one of the other problems that we have, youth sports in America has drifted to a very bad place. And I say this from the experience of my son playing travel, high-level soccer and all of that. It has become so about the money and so about individuality. All right. Everyone imagines that their kid's going to be getting the scholarship. And so instead of a lot of the lessons that I think you and I probably learned, well, you're younger than I am, so you might have experienced a slightly tougher world. It becomes much more about sort of the individual standing out from everybody else. And the people running these programs, they're trying to survive one day or the next. They want the parents' money more than anything. And I think it is really undermining some of those basic lessons of teamwork, and how you work together to achieve something. Now, some teams were better than others that my son worked with where they had that, but everyone is so individually focused that I think it's really important. And I will say in this case, I think this can be very important lessons for girls too. Girls playing team sports, being involved in a collective effort. But I just think we need to get back to the idea that the reason the overwhelming majority of young people, be they boys or girls, are playing sports is exercise, give them some activity, make them better that way, and then also to learn some of the life lessons that you've talked about. It's not so that you can prove to everybody that your kid's the best baseball player in town. Okay. Most of these kids, 98% of them, are never going to play past high school. Let's start focusing on that instead of all of this emphasis on how do we pick the stars and elevate them. I think that has undermined the usefulness of youth athletics. And I've heard this from a lot of other parents all across the country. And the final piece of it that's problematic is it's so damned expensive now, you know, that if you don't have means, the ability of your child to be able to actively engage, something else I think, and I know the Sounders are working on this, trying to set up leagues and everything. So if you don't have the means, there's scholarships, you can find a field, for instance, because that's getting increasingly competitive. So yeah, I think youth athletics are incredibly important. I think they do need a little bit of work to make them a little bit better in terms of being positive educational role models for young people participating in them at this point.
Okay, great. Well, thank
Yeah.
you so much for speaking with me. Thanks for your
Yeah.
time.
No, and I really appreciate your work. And yeah, let's, stay in touch. And as we're, spreading this both in the state and on the federal level, I think, passing legislation, but more than anything, what you're doing that's so positive is raising awareness. Because as you said, this is something that people didn't think was a problem, didn't talk about. And I think that's changed. There's a lot of books coming out, a lot of studies that are examining this. I think I forget that someone just came out with a book, Galloway, I think is his name. Yeah, he's been all over the media, and that's helpful. We need to really start having these conversations. So let me know how I can be helpful to what you're doing.
Thank you. And likewise, if there's anything now or that comes up in the future that I can help with, I'm pretty well networked with those in other states and at the national level who are working on similar boys and
Okay,
men type causes.
cool. All right. Well, thank you very much. It was great talking with you.